Good evening, guys. Welcome to Going After Cacciato lecture, chapters 35 through 40. This should be a shorter lecture than the past couple ones have been, so let's get started. Lots of important stuff. Chapter 35, World's Greatest Lake Country. Very interesting chapter for a couple of reasons. One is that we get an interesting contrast between Cacciato and Paul. Cacciato's dad, this is when Cacciato's fishing in the crater where there are no fish. Cacciato says his dad told him to have patience, and Paul says that that's funny, that his dad had always told him to look for the good things. Paul says that his dad didn't say that. This is interesting because when you look at these two ideologies, these two beliefs, this one is really one of accepting, and then Paul's is really one of seeking or of looking for things. And Cacciato really does just kind of accept how things are. He doesn't push against them, whereas Paul is constantly seeking and pushing, especially in terms of the fantasy and needing to find a way to get things better with to make things better with his issue with killing Cacciato accidentally. While they're talking, Cacciato moves from talking about the fish to talking about Lieutenant Martin. And this conversation is about the lieutenant. Make no mistake, this is about whether or not they're going to kill the lieutenant. Cacciato knows what they're talking about. He knows that Oscar's upset. And so the conversation bleeds back and forth between being about fishing, or is it about Lieutenant Martin, or is it about Third Squad? It really goes all over the place. And Cacciato asks Paul, says, "What about you?" And Paul removes himself and he says, "I'm just the messenger," right? He's not taking any action. And yet again, like, chance to be brave right here. Paul could say, like, "Oh, I don't think it's right either, and we should really stand up and say something about it." Chance to be brave, missed yet again. Paul says, "I'm just the messenger," and really takes himself out of this situation. It's actually a really interesting correlation to the Bible as well, in terms of like people like not following through on actions. And when Jesus was being tried in the Bible in front of Pilate, that the defense that a lot of the disciples gave was that they were just there, like that's what this guy says, and we just happen to be there, but we don't necessarily believe it. It's kind of interesting idea given Paul's biblical name as well. Chapter 36. Flights of Imagination. This is one of the fantasy chapters, even though Paris is not in the title. It's definitely a fantasy chapter. This is when they're being set up to be killed. They've been captured by the SAVAK, the secret intelligence organization. Their cover's been blown. Their stories come through. This is really most interesting because reality is starting to push into this fantasy. Paul's having a harder and harder time keeping this fantasy going. And in the middle of this chapter, it references in his tower by the sea, Paul Berlin considered the possibilities. And so we have Paul in the middle of this story acknowledging that it's reality, that we have this kind of dip where we could say that if this is the fantasy and this is reality, that this chapter is kind of all through here, that everything kind of, reality keeps showing back up in this chapter. And eventually, Paul just moves straight into the absurd. He's so desperate to keep this, I spelled that word wrong, I'm sorry. Paul moves right into the absurd. He's so desperate to keep this story going. He creates this fantastic getaway scene. He says, why not? He was the miracle man. It was an Impala in 1964. And then describes it. The racing stripes, the dice in the mirror, the fender skirts, the mud flats, chopped and channeled, leopard skin upholstery. Like, there's no logic here. This is not a car that you would find in Iran. This is not a car that would suddenly show up, right? Then a getaway car. Like, there it is, magic. Paul has just pushed into the into the absurd, right? He's past the fantastic. The fantastic was this whole story. And now he's moved into the absurd, which is just completely beyond the reality, completely beyond any chance that this is actually happening, because he has to keep this narrative going. Otherwise, he has to actually did. Chapter 37, how the land was, kind of an interesting chapter. This chapter brings us back to reality. This is a true chapter. And these next couple of chapters, chapters 37 and 39, we really see Tim O'Brien at his most honest, I think, talking the most honestly about Vietnam and how it really was to be there. And it says that Paul did not know the land. He did not know the people who lived on the land, but the land itself he knew very well. And we should think back to that conversation he has with Lee Van Hock in the tunnels, where Lee Van Hock talks about the idea of Za and how land is the true enemy, and this idea that they were fighting the land itself. And Paul is saying now that he knows the land but doesn't understand the people, but he really is well grounded in the land. What I would like you guys to do is identify a quote from this chapter that characterizes the land and explain how the land is characterized by focusing on the specific word choice. So there's lots of very good imagery here, and that's really what I want you guys looking at, is the imagery in this chapter. If you would like some extra credit, you can post it on the blog. And if you don't want any extra credit, please just answer in your notes. Please make sure you highlight where the answer is so I can find it. You can earn some extra credit. But find a quote that shows the land and explain how the land's characterized by focusing on specific word choice so that we can look at that in the upcoming days. On the lam to Paris. Lam means escape. So this title, the title of the chapter is on escaping to Paris. They have escaped from Iran and they're heading to Paris. So on the lam, running from the law, having escaped from somewhere. Chapter's interesting in that we see Sarkin as a guide figure, again most prominently. Softly, effortlessly, she guided the old man toward recovery. Through him, she guided all of them. Again, this is in Paul's fantasy, but he sees her in this role of a guide of this person who's taking them where he needs to be. She's kind of helping him work through a lot of this. Chapter 38 is also interesting. Stink jumps ship. The fantasy hits another snag in that there are authorities waiting for them at the dock, and Stink thinks that their goose is cooked, that they're up, their jig is up, that they're in trouble. And so he just jumps ship. Given that this is Paul's fantasy, and Stink represents the kind of impulsive aspect of Paul's nature, we can see this as Paul starting to mature, just a little bit. Stink is the one, remember, who kills the water buffalo that ends up causing the problem with Sarkin. He is the most impulsive, most quick to act, kind of most aggressive of the characters. And by removing him from the story, we can kind of see that Paul is trying to remove those aspects from his life. Really, maybe trying to grow, try to evolve as a person. Chapter 39, things they didn't know. This is an important chapter. This chapter connects back to chapter 37 that we just looked at. Because in chapter 37, it says, not knowing the language, they did not know the people. And up at the chapter 37, it says that they did not know the people who lived on the land, but the land itself he knew well. And so just reinforcing this idea that Paul and all the soldiers, that they don't know the people, they don't know the land, they really are just out of their element, as it were. And then it's a lot of Paul explaining himself and of talking about things where he says that he had no enemies. he had wronged no one, that he really feels like he hasn't done anything to deserve what's happening to him. He doesn't understand that he's a representative of America as a soldier, that he kind of stands in for that. We know that Paul doesn't agree with the war. We know this is the chapter where he talks about wishing he could apologize and say that he doesn't support what's going on. But again, he doesn't. He doesn't speak up. He doesn't say anything. He just continues to think these thoughts without ever giving voice to them. Chapter 39 is also where Paul is up for a promotion. This promotion, you will notice, is not based on skill, not based on his talent. It's just a promotion. The questions they ask are just completely ridiculous. They ask him how many stars are on the flag, how many stripes. They ask him the muzzle velocity of a rifle. Has nothing to do with any actual skills. And there's this very interesting conversation between him and the promotions board where they ask him why we're fighting this war. And Paul stutters and kind of stumbles over his words. And they give him the answer and they say, we're fighting this war to win it. This is such a backwards concept. Right? They don't say that we're fighting the war because communism is wrong and we want to, like, we're fighting this war to win it. Granted, winning a war is what you want to do, but winning is not the reason that you fight. Like, there's no reason for this war. And this is really coming through in these last couple of chapters, that there's not a clear reason for the war. Paul doesn't understand the reason for the war. The soldiers don't understand the reasons for the war. And the military's command doesn't care. Like, they're fighting the war to win it at this point. And so that's what Paul says. In chapter 39, and this quote gets cut off a little bit, but we have one of the most important quotes in the entire book. One of the most important passages in the entire book. The bottom part of this got cut off, but this will give you the general idea. And this is on page 270 and 271. And Tim O'Brien really steps out of character here and just talks at the reader about the problems with this war. And there are so many key things in this quote. This is really the quote that sums up all of Tim O'Brien's anger and frustration and conflict within himself about the war. This idea of no sense of order or momentum we've seen before, no trenches. They did not have targets. They did not have a cause. They did not know if it was a war of ideology. That means beliefs. Economics means money. Hegemony, or hegemony, however you pronounce it. Hegemony is political power or spite, just anger. They don't know what they're doing. They don't have a reason for being there. They're really just kind of mucking through this war and really just making a mess of it. This quote, this passage on 270, 271 is so important because this is Tim O'Brien at his most honest, talking about the amount of confusion in this war. He lays it out for us towards the end of the book and just kind of puts it out there that this whole book has been building and building and building and building. And we really see the amount of frustration in him at this. One of the pieces that got cut off from this quote that's very important, though, is the very last phrase of this chapter is they did not know good from evil. At that most basic divide between right and wrong, these soldiers don't even know what side they're on. Such an important quote, really showing Tim O'Brien's frustrations with the war. Chapter 40, by a stretch of the imagination. This is when the boat is pulling into the harbor. Stink has just jumped off the boat. It says it could not have ended that way. Cops and customs agents. And then Paul switches back to the observation post in the middle of this chapter and says that this is not a madman's fantasy. Paul Berlin is awake and fully sane. Really kind of justifying to himself what he's doing. And then they get off the boat and the cops and customs agents are just there for someone else. And Paul says his imagination, keen as a razor's edge, cut through ordinary obstacles. What's so interesting here is his imagination doesn't have anything to do with it. He just ignores the problem. In his imagination, he sees that there are cops, and he just chooses to not acknowledge them and just walks past them. That's not dealing with the problem. This is just like him with Cacciato. He's just ignoring the issues and kind of moving past them. And he credits his imagination and pats himself on the back. And it's complete BS, right? He doesn't cut through the obstacle, he just ignores it. This chapter is really interesting because then really randomly we get this other non-logical thing where they meet this California girl driving this RV bus across wherever they are. I think now they're in Germany somewhere, or Turkey. And she's talking to them and says, I was a dropout myself, 2 years at San Diego State, all the bullshit in the world, couldn't hack it, so bang, I quit. And then it's actually Oscar in the quote says, you say it's the same, NAM and fucking San Diego State. This passage is interesting because in the previous chapter we see the soldiers, Tim O'Brien's view of how the soldiers feel about the war. And in this piece with the California girl, we see a couple of things. One, we see Paul's desire on how he would like to be seen, particularly by females, as doing the right thing, dropping out of a war he doesn't support. But at the exact same time, this is contrasted with the public's kind of ignorance. This girl has no idea what they're dealing with. She has no idea the stuff they're going through. To her, like her professors lecturing at her in college, she's equating that with what they're going through in Vietnam. And this really shows that even though the student protests were pivotal in Vietnam, that there's really a disconnect between the soldiers in Vietnam and the students in America. And even though they both oppose the war, they really have such different perspectives on it that they're not ever really going to agree. That the soldiers are dealing with things that these students can't imagine, and the students are trying to relate to the soldiers, and it's really just making it worse because the soldiers are like, you have no idea what I've been through. Which is a really interesting chapter in seeing the kind of conflict in Paul's mind. He wants to be seen as doing the right thing and having the support of these kids, but at the same time recognizes that they don't know what they're talking about. They've never seen the stuff that he's had to go through. Then we get some foreshadowing here. He says he's felt like he's riding on ice, that the story is continuing to gain speed, moving faster. But more interestingly enough is this idea of riding on ice just conveys this idea of being on thin ice and of being on something that at any moment could just fall out from underneath him. This whole story at this point is just kind of on a thread, and he's just trying to make it through as best he can. And what he's gaining in speed, he's losing in kind of security, right? That the faster the story goes, the less and less sense it makes, because he just has to get through the end and has to get to the part where Cacciato did not die, because that's the whole point of telling this story. These chapters are really interesting, 35 through 40, in that they show up at the end of our novel. We're really pushing in, but this is where we start to see Paul's reality and fantasy blending in the fantasy sequences. He's acknowledging that he's in the observation post. We see the most honest assessment of the soldiers in the war, and we see the conflict between Paul himself, but also Paul and the students who will be back in America protesting as well. This concludes your flipped classroom lecture. Please don't forget to take the quiz after watching the lecture. Remember to post on the blog if you want extra credit. If not, make sure you answer in your notes so you can get regular credit. Have a good evening.